I was at Mirror Lake for 35 days, and it was the scariest and best time of my life.
Before I came to Mirror Lake, I was a mess. My life was in shambles. My family didn't really want anything to do with me. I didn't really have true friends. Today, I can say that, I have true friendship today. There's women that I can call for anything. And within the AA community, there's people that can help me.
I didn't feel like I was alone. I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be in just a beautiful setting.
The anger management group really helped me a lot with dealing with that. I really like the art classes. You're outside a lot while you're here. You get to walk to and from group. There's outside activities. They let you play volleyball. It's really nice. You can sit here and reflect on your day and reflect your life basically. Sitting here staring at the pond, talking to the ducks.
And I am 7 months sober, and I have my now 2-year-old back living with me. I have a 7-week-old, which is insane. But I got my license back. I have a car. I have a job. I just moved into an apartment. If it weren't for Mirror Lake, I wouldn't have these things. I wouldn't have the opportunity to wake up and kiss both my kids. And thank God every morning that I'm sober. And because of Mirror Lake, I have all those things.
Mirror Lake is a place that can help the whole person, not just to stop using, but to begin to learn what it means to be a healthy individual. We're helping people individuate in ways to become the person that we believe God intended them to be when they were first born.
Don't give up. Come here, try it. What's the worst that could happen, You might learn something.
It's gonna save someone's life, and it should be yours. So give yourself the opportunity to try this out and stick it out for 28 days or 35 days or 60 days, because it's gonna open a lot of doors that you never thought were possible.
All right, thank you so much, Jack. Jack is one of the people that make me so proud to teach here at this university that I love so much. If y'all have not seen Jack's commencement address at the U of M graduation, it was maybe 5 to 10 years ago. You could find it on YouTube. It's absolutely inspiring. He tells his story. And Jack, thank you for all that you do. Thank all of you for all that you do. I appreciate you being here. We're all here trying to do the same thing, which is help people suffering with alcohol and drug misuse and addiction. And so again, I appreciate all that you're doing. I'm going to try to keep everybody awake. I know on the one hand, many of you have had caffeine, which will help in my goal. On the other hand, with all this rain, it sounds like one of those sleep machines, right? And it's dark in here, so please try to keep the eyes open to the extent that you can. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I'm going to talk about sort of evidence-based behavioral treatments for alcohol and drug misuse and addiction. And I added a colon to my title because you can't be a decent academic without having a colon in your paper titles, right? So one size does not fit all. One of the things I'm going to talk about is that we've spent a lot of time, importantly today, talking about folks with severe addiction. But really, alcohol and drug use, there's a whole continuum, a whole spectrum of severity, right? So I'm going to talk about approaches for helping people with more severe addiction, but also approaches for reaching the larger number of people with more mild to moderate problems. who will never show up in specialty addiction treatment settings. So I'll talk about ways in which we could try to help those folks as well. All right, so the theory that guides a lot of my work is called behavioral economics, right? And so behavioral economics is this model where we try to understand choices people make and decisions people make based on a cost-benefit analysis, right? So whenever we decide what to do with our time, right, it has to do with what is available to us in our environment. How easy is that to access? And what are the alternatives available in our environment, right? So in an environment where drugs and alcohol are highly available, right, there will be a lot of choice for alcohol and drugs. In an environment where there's a lot of other ways of experiencing reward, right? Because as our previous speaker and many of the speakers have talked about, drugs are potent brain rewards. But thankfully, there's lots of other activities that are also potent brain rewards, right? If I do my job, sitting here and listening and learning something new is a potent brain reward, right? The coffee you're drinking, the brownie that you might have been fortunate enough to have, all those things light up our brains in the same way that drugs do. Not as intense, right? But they're all rewards, right? So ultimately, people are more likely to use drugs when drugs are easy to get and when other ways of experiencing reward are more difficult to get, right? So that's where we think about it as choice. This does not mean that people make a conscious choice to become addicted. Instead, what it means is people's choices about drugs and alcohol are influenced by the environment that they live in. So there's one immediate complicating factor when we look about choice between drugs and doing other things, right? And what's that? Well, drugs effects are immediate. As soon as you take a drug, your brain feels better. Also, usually it's very easy to take a drug. You don't have to work very hard, right? Whereas that spin class that you might go to, right, when you set your alarm at 5 a.m., right, or that run you're going to go on, that's hard, right? You might feel better at the end after you've gotten home, had your snack, taken your shower, you get that nice little exercise high, but you got to work to get that high, right? So drug rewards are always more appealing because they're easy and they're immediate. It's much harder when we have to work to feel that reward that's delayed, right? So when we think about trying to help folks with addiction or try to prevent addiction, there's two things we want to do. One, we want to increase their ability to experience natural rewards, right? And two, we want to try to shift their mindset so that they're thinking more about the future, right? Because if they're just weighing the pros and cons of do I drink right now or do I study for this test, right? You know that drinking is always going to be more fun, right? So it's a matter of getting them to think more about the future. The other thing that's complicated in this choice between drugs and alternatives is that when most people use drugs, especially when they start, they are not alone, right? They are with other people. And we're learning more and more in research, even people with very severe addiction. We have this idea that, and there are some people like this, that are solitary users, right? But for the most part, drug use is a social activity, right? Across the drug category, you see people using drugs in groups. And these are groups of people that often care about each other, right? And so when we're asking people to shift their behavior away from drugs, we're not only asking them to give up on that drug reward, we're asking them often to give up on all the social reward that goes with that. And oftentimes, people start to develop a social network that is exclusively other people who are drinking and using drugs, right? So we're often asking them to start from scratch. And given that humans are social animals, right, we need social support like we need water. That's a big ask, right? And so again, if we're thinking about prevention, we're thinking about treatment, if our treatments are going to work, they have to give people an easy path to social connection, right? Give people another way of connecting with other people that doesn't involve taking substances. This idea that drugs are more likely to be misused in deprived environments has been demonstrated for decades, right? So some of the earliest studies that are really compelling, raise your hand if you've heard of the rat park studies. Maybe raise your hand. Yeah, so these were incredible studies. They took rats that were genetically identical and they randomized them to two conditions, right? In one condition, they're in this very deprived cage where they're by themselves, they have nothing to do, they could get water and food, but the only other thing they could do is press a lever to get amphetamine or some other drug, right? In this other condition, rat park, these are the very enriched sort of richy rich rats. They have this nice palatial cage with lots of other rats to play with. They've got running wheels, right? Well, when you give these rats access to methamphetamine or another drug, they don't really care for it that much, right? They might use it a little bit, right? But they don't become addicted, right? These rats up here are way more likely to become addicted, right? And in this experiment, they just looked at changing one thing, giving rats access to a wheel to run on, right? And just introducing that one other way of experiencing reward, right? Through movement and exercise, you get a reduction in drug use, right? So a very powerful demonstration, right? You can never do an experiment like this with humans because it wouldn't be ethical, but we have lots of other evidence, right? Not from experiments, but from epidemiological studies like this, where if you plot drug overdose rates, right? You see this is a heat map. The more red equals the more drug overdoses, right? Well, what else do you see in these areas, right, where you have a lot of drug overdoses, right? You see more people, more opioid prescribing, right? So drugs being available. You see less people graduating college, more people divorced, more unemployment, more poverty, more single parent families, right? So all of these things that are sort of the equivalent of the rat park study are borne out if we look at data on who becomes addicted and who doesn't, and who dies from overdose and who doesn't, right? So when we think about deprivation with humans, we're thinking about a lot of complicated things that the struggles that we have in our society, right? So what is a deprived environment, right? A deprived environment is one in which people are experiencing poverty, right? They don't have access to quality education. People are experiencing systematic racism or discrimination, right? Or any form of oppression, right? In those environments, you see much higher levels of drug and alcohol use. Mental health conditions often rob us of our ability to experience reward, right? If we're depressed, if we're anxious, we have less of an ability to experience reward. When we're in that deprived state, drug reward becomes incredibly powerful because it's the only game in town. It's the only way to sort of light up our brain and to get that good feeling, right? Medical conditions, we talked about throughout today, people who experience pain or disability, and all of a sudden that exercise habit that they used to love, that walk in the park that used to give them something to do, a reason to get up, you pull that away, right? And it becomes a lot more difficult to control your alcohol use, right? Or it becomes a lot more difficult not to use cannabis all day long, right? Because you don't have those other things that used to give you a sense of meaning or a sense of purpose, right? And then, of course, as we've talked about throughout the day, the vicious cycle of addiction is that the more you use drugs, it actually changes your brain, so your ability to experience natural rewards is impaired, right? So that's the vicious cycle. And thankfully, as the last speaker nicely pointed out, that comes back with a period of abstinence, right? So if you stop using for a while, eventually your ability to experience reward returns, right? But it's really hard in those initial stages, right? And that's where people need a lot of support, they need a lot of fellowship, they need really a supportive environment to carry them through those first several months of recovery when other things don't feel very good, right? And they need to know that it's going to come back, right? So I like to think of addiction, of course, it's a brain disease, right? But addiction is also a disease of the environment, right? And I think sometimes policymakers are a little too quick to only focus on the brain disease, because then it absolves them of the responsibility of trying to solve some of the social problems like poverty, right? Like discrimination, that might make drugs more appealing for a lot of people who have been marginalized in our society, right? So of course it's a brain disease, it's also a disease of the environment, right? Okay, so a little bit about epidemiology. And one thing is that, you know, I think we've probably seen this slide before today, right? We all know we are in an unprecedented addiction epidemic, unprecedented throughout the course of human history. We've hardly ever seen any public health epidemic as bad as this epidemic. And it's unbelievable to see how much it's increasing, right? It just keeps increasing. And we hear a lot rightly about fentanyl, right? More and more we're seeing overdose deaths with methamphetamine as well, and of course combinations. I'm going to talk also today about alcohol, because I think that's being forgotten a little bit in this. And so 30% of drug overdose deaths have alcohol on board as well, right? So it's also about alcohol. And over the last 2 decades, we've had a 50% increase in alcohol-related deaths. In particular, men are way more likely than women to die from alcohol, and folks in rural environments are more likely to die from alcohol than folks in urban environments. Not surprisingly, during the pandemic, we talked about deprivation. I think the pandemic was just a really potent natural experiment where we all saw what life was like if you sort of immediately pull away a lot of the things that give us joy and purpose, and all of a sudden we're just home every day talking on Zoom, right? And not doing a lot of the things that bring us joy. Not surprisingly, alcohol becomes a more potent, a more important source of reward during the pandemic. And predictably, we had about a third increase in drinking-related deaths during the pandemic. Right. The other really interesting thing about drinking, right, is that it is a very developmental phenomenon. So this is a really incredible, this shows the percentage of binge drinking in the US population as a function of age. So young people, 18 to 24, almost 50% of them report binge drinking, right, which is remarkable. And then that number goes down with age. This is the average number of drinks per occasion. So young people drink about 4 to 5 drinks on average, right? And it goes down linearly over time. Interestingly, as we get older, we drink more often, right? But we drink way less frequent, way less quantities, right? So when we think about how to prevent the harm with alcohol, we want to really focus on that young adult population, right? And so even though addiction is important, I think sometimes the focus on addiction sort of obscures the fact that most people who experience difficulties with alcohol and other drugs are not addicted, right? That sounds strange to say, but it's true. There's way more people who are drinking in that sort of binge level. They're not physically dependent. They're not experiencing severe everyday consequences from drinking, right? But they're exceeding healthy drinking limits, right? And those people often are left out of our formal treatment programs. And they may have this notion that if I don't look like that person who's overdosing on the street, or if I don't look like that person who's, sitting home drinking a fifth of vodka every day, I'm fine. I just drink with my friends. There can't be anything wrong with that, right? Well, in fact, we now know more and more there's a lot of harm that can be done with people who are well below the level that we might consider addiction. And as we'll talk about, there's a lot of ways we could really help those people and prevent them from potentially escalating. So what is risky drinking, right? There's a number of different ways to define it. Binge drinking, right? So for men having 5 or more drinks, for women having 4 or more drinks, these thresholds are probably too high. In Canada, they've already lowered it. So it's for men having 4 or more drinks is considered a binge episode, for women having 3 or more, right? Having 15 or more drinks in a week for men is considered at-risk drinking, meaning you're at risk for health consequences, right? Cancer, heart disease, cognitive problems, right? So these are not people who are missing work and who are having severe problems, but yet there are still health and social problems that arise from this. Of course, any alcohol use by women who are pregnant or people under 21 can be risky. And I see people taking pictures. I'll share my slides. I have my email on the first and last slide, so you don't need to. I'll share all of these if you want them. You could just send me an email, but feel free to take pictures if you want as well. So really, if you want to think about what is safe drinking, the guidelines are really more like probably not having more than 1 drink in a day for women and not more than 2 drinks in a day for men, and probably not doing that every day, right? Because if you sort of need that to go to sleep every day, right? You're impairing your sleep and you're not getting good sleep, and then that's impacting your health, right? And that could become more sort of habit forming. So despite the beverage industry's claims for years that having 1 or 2 drinks a day is good for your heart, it's not, right? That's completely not true. And that's been shown now nicely through this. This is a big study by the Lancet that came out a few years ago. And it showed the more drinks you have per day, the more your health risk goes up. And that starts with 1, right? So it's a clear dose effect curve. The more you drink, the worse off your health is. Similarly, any reduction somebody is willing to make with their drinking will enhance their health, right? And we take a harm reduction approach, right? We can't tell people what to do, right? We can ask people to think about what is best for them, and that might be a drinking reduction. And what these data suggest is that any reduction you make is going to serve, is going to enhance your health, right? Okay. Another thing with drinking and drug use is that, and this is where many young people who might not have any sort of severe problem, it only takes one incident to change your life forever, right? So this is the risk of a fatal traffic accident for people using substances. And you can see by far, alcohol is the most dangerous single substance because it's just a motor impairing substance. It really slows you down, right? And then if you combine alcohol with another drug, that's even worse, right? One of the things I hear a lot from the young people I work with is that, oh, well, cannabis is not really that bad, right? Well, and they have a good point, right? It's nowhere near, this is marijuana. So you have a 1.83 times the likelihood of having a fatal car accident, right? So it's way less than alcohol, but it's still almost twice the odds of having a fatal car accident as compared to if you're not using anything at all, right? So I think it's important for us as prevention folks to be credible. We don't want to exaggerate harms, but we also, it's important to keep in mind that cannabis does impair driving ability. It's clear that it does, and it's not as bad as alcohol, but it still clearly impairs your ability to operate a motor vehicle. So one of the things that we've learned is that addiction is, alcohol and drug misuse is not a binary, right? I think we're learning more and more in society. There are no binaries. Everything is on a continuum, right? And so with alcohol and drugs, we have a whole range of severity. We have many people who are very low risk, right? A couple drinks a week, very low risk. We have people who are at some risk, at mild, moderate, and then severe, right? This is sort of the neglected population. I think that a lot of our theories and treatment models are really geared towards people with very severe problems, which is important because those people are most likely to die and to have really bad outcomes. But there's a lot of people who are using alcohol and other drugs occasionally and at a binge level, or maybe they're not getting in trouble, but they need it every night to go to sleep. They don't find our treatments appealing, and they don't identify as a quote unquote alcoholic or an addict. And so a lot of times that binary makes them think, well, I don't need any help, and there's nothing out there for me. I'm not going to go to AA. That's not sort of consistent with the level of my problem, right? And so as it turns out, there's a lot we could do for folks like that I will talk about. The other thing is that there used to be this notion that addiction is a necessary progression. It necessarily gets worse, right? And if you take people who are really severe and you ask them about their history, they will describe a progression, right? But that's sort of not accurate from a research perspective. There's a lot of people who never progress beyond these mild or moderate levels of problems, and yet they still have significant problems, right? They're still not living the life that they would want to live. They're still not the parents that they could be, ideally, if they were drinking less, right? They're still underachieving at work or in their in school, right? So they're experiencing problems even if they don't reach the level of addiction. They might not necessarily progress, but they could still improve quite a bit if they made changes. Those changes might not be abstinence. Those changes might be a reduction. And as treatment and prevention providers, I think it's important for us to recognize that one size doesn't fit all, right? Some of our models that work really well with severe people might not work very well with people with more mild to moderate problems. So the conundrum is, right, this is the holy grail, right, of prevention and treatment is, I'm sorry, the top is cut off. What it says is that only 15% of people with alcohol and drug problems present for treatment. Only 15%. Treatment really works, but it doesn't work if you don't go, right? And so how do we get more people to go to treatment, right? So first we have to ask ourselves, well, why do most people, 85% of people, not go to treatment, right? So of course, stigma, right? Labels, right? Privacy concerns. But then again, a mismatch, right? There's often a mismatch between their level of severity and the available treatments, right? Or feeling that the problem is not severe enough for them to go ahead and go to a rehab. So many people, if you ask them, what does alcohol and drug treatment look like? They'll say, oh, it's either AA or it's detox or it's Malibu, right? Or spending $20,000 to go to a place and leave their family for a month. Well, if you have somebody who's struggling with, using cannabis a little more often than they'd like to, or somebody who's binge drinking a few times a week, those are not reasonable options for them. And many people don't know that there are other options out there. Many people believe they could quit without treatment, and actually most people do, right? Most people who recover from addiction never step foot in a treatment facility. They recover on their own, right? Now, they recover using a lot of the same elements that we have in treatment, right? For example, they make a change in their social group, right? They develop new interests, new hobbies, right? They have maybe a change in their perspective, right? Based on maybe becoming a parent, or maybe some sort of spiritual experience, right? That just allows them to see things in a different way. So it's the same mechanisms, but those things often happen outside of formal treatment. What leads people to seek treatment, right? So as therapists, many of us see clients and patients, and we think, well, how can I encourage somebody to go to treatment, given that it works pretty well? Well, one thing that a lot of research has shown is that people are not often motivated to go to treatment because they're drinking or using drugs too much. It's not about the amount, it's about the consequences in their life. And so one of the things that I think is really important is to give people a space to talk about, for them, what ways has alcohol or drugs impacted your life? Tell me a little bit about your drinking. Tell me about some of the good things about it. And then tell me about some of the not so good things, right? What are ways in which alcohol has gotten in the way of your goals? Or what are ways in which your drug use might impact your health, right? And really listening, because for everybody, it's something different. Again, it's not one size fits all. And getting people to talk about the impact of alcohol and drugs on their lives is a big way to motivate them to pursue treatment. The other reason people pursue treatment is when people that they care about tell them to, right? So every psychological treatment is more effective if it involves significant others. Like that's just sort of a truism in clinical psych and counseling psych, is that no matter what the treatment is, if you could bring in members of people's network that are supportive, that treatment will be more effective. So if you're trying to help motivate somebody to pursue addiction treatment or to make changes in their alcohol or drug use, with their permission, try to get them to bring in somebody who cares about them so that they could talk about their perspective on your client's alcohol and drug use. All right, and then we also know a lot from research on what actually are the factors that support successful long-term recovery. And this research has looked at both people who used treatment and people who changed on their own. And it's actually the same factors for both groups of people, right? So it's things like making a drastic change in your social group. Most people who are successful in recovery stop hanging out with the same people, right? Most people get support from significant others and family, right? Most people develop a new passion, right? A lot of people become really into exercise, right? A lot of people throw themselves into volunteer work, right? They find a new passion. People with addiction often have a lot of drive, right? Because it takes often a lot of drive to kind of obtain drugs, right? It's a lot of energy. Sometimes those people go on to do great things in other domains once they have that positive outlet, something else to organize their time around, something else to really care about. Another factor is avoiding situations where alcohol and drugs are present. That's especially important early in recovery, right? So I'm sort of going through this with the idea that when you're working with a client, right, these are the sorts of things that you want to facilitate. You want to, whether it's somebody in long-term recovery, whether it's somebody who you're seeing as an outpatient therapist or in primary care, and they're not even interested in abstaining, but they're interested in making some change in reducing their use, these same factors are helpful, right? So think about how you could facilitate those things as a therapist or as a friend or as a family member, right? The other thing that's pretty clear is that people tend to recover successfully if life gets better when they make the decision to stop using. And so as a therapist who's trying to facilitate that, we do a lot of problem solving. We do a lot of helping people to build a life worth living, right? Often from scratch, right? That often does involve, consistent with the traditions of 12-step, making amends and sort of fixing relationships, right, that have been neglected. It might involve attending to your physical health that you might have neglected while you were using, right? So that your physical health becomes something that can be a source of reward for you going forward, right? But all those things take time, right? And so that's sort of some of the things that I think should sort of organize what we do as therapists trying to support people's successful long-term recovery. We often miss substance use, right? And I'm going to just talk a little bit practically about, why that is. People, if you're in a general primary care or mental health setting, people are reluctant to ask about alcohol and drug use oftentimes, right? They're afraid it's sort of, people will find it rude or it's stigmatizing. And so I want to encourage you to be very direct and open about that and talk a little bit about how to do that. One is to be very direct, right? So I like to say, how many drinks have you had in the past 7 days, right? What's the greatest amount of alcohol you've consumed in a day over the past year? That's important because there are some people, again, all it takes is one incident to alter your life forever, right? And many people who don't drink regularly will occasionally, maybe it's at a wedding, right? Maybe it's when they see their friend from college who comes visits, when they see this certain particular cousin, right? It only takes one event. So in addition to asking about how much have you had to drink over the last 7 days, I also think it's important to ask about what's the most you've had to drink in any one day over the past year, right? What drugs have you used, right? And it's important to ask all this in a very non-judgmental way and in a very matter-of-fact way, right? One of the things you should not do is, and this is what happens, I notice this when I go see medical providers, they'll say, do you drink a lot? But who's going to say yes to that, right? Well, what do you mean by lots, right? These very vague questions, or they'll ask the question in a way that assumes a negative answer, right? Or there's a sense that if I tell you yes, that's going to go in my medical record, right? So we have to be very sensitive about these things. There's a myth that you can't trust people who use alcohol and drugs to be honest, and that's a harmful, stigmatizing myth that people with addiction are deceitful, right? If people will be deceitful if they stand to lose something from being honest, right? So if somebody's going to see their parole officer and they know if they say, yeah, I was smoking weed before I came here, that they're gonna lie, right? But if you are able to create a space where you say, some of the things I'm gonna ask you about are, sensitive. And I want to let you know that anything you tell me, is not going to be used against you, right? Other than if you talk about, the normal caveats with hurting yourself or hurting somebody else. It's important to say the space is safe, and it's important you ask very specific questions, right? Also asking about risky specific things. Drinking and driving is a big one. Blacking out is a really big one. People that black out from drinking, that's a really big sign of risk. Because if you black out, you're not in control, and bad things could happen when you black out, right? And of course, we have to also gauge risk of overdose. The previous speaker really importantly pointed out that we have kids using cannabis not realizing they're getting fentanyl, right? When I was a kid, there were scare talks. They were mostly not really accurate. You use drugs once and you're gonna, die. Now they're accurate. It's actually true, right? Like this is real now. So we do want to ask about those things. Another thing that I would suggest if you have time as a clinician is to really have people monitor their drinking and drug use over time, right? Keep track of the situations, right? When do you use, under what conditions? What are the moods that lead you to drink more than you want to? Who are the people you're around, right? We call this a functional analysis in psychology, but it could be very helpful. People learn about themselves, right, in this process. We need to really appreciate why people use alcohol and drugs. People have good reasons, right? It's not a character flaw. People use drugs for the same reason many of us drink caffeine, or many of us will have an occasional glass of wine with dinner because it feels good. There's nothing pathological about that. And so we want to sort of understand why people use drugs and why they drink, what the benefits are. Understanding those benefits will allow us to help them to make a change, right? Because if they're getting something from alcohol and we're going to try to motivate them to drink less, well, we better find them another way of getting that thing that they were getting. Otherwise, it's a tough ask. So this is a functional analysis. And then it's also important, to think about, well, why are they here? What do they want from treatment? Were they compelled to come here? Is this the court? Is this their partner? Is this them coming, right? You can't really help somebody until you fully understand what are the factors that motivated them to come in. Are they here for depression? But you ask a question and you realize, ooh, they're here for depression. But as it turns out, they're having 2 or 3 drinks a night. In my clinician mind, I recognize they may not realize that's part of their depression, but it is, right? But I can't just like hit it head on. I've got to sort of operate from their motivational framework, right? And gently understand more about how alcohol fits in with their mood, right? And help them with their depression, but then gently put alcohol on the table as well, right? So we have to really understand why somebody is coming to see us. I like asking this: what would you like to do, if anything, about your drinking or drug use? We want to use as many open-ended questions as we can. I'm going to talk about motivational interviewing. Raise your hand if you've heard about or had motivational interviewing training. Great, I love it. It's probably the best way to communicate with people generally, even outside of counseling. And understand what their goals are. Do they want to abstain? Do they want to try to drink or use drugs in a moderate way? If so, what does moderate mean to them, right? Because moderate means different things to different people. A lot of research suggests that controlled drinking is possible, but it's only possible if people have very specific goals, right? And they have a plan in place for if they violate those rules, then what's plan B, right? Also, moderate drinking is more likely after you reset your tolerance and take a month or 2 when you don't drink at all, right? It's much more likely to be successful. So when I have a client that tells me that that's their goal, I listen, right? I want to understand why. And then I give them information about the data suggesting that people are more likely to be successful at that goal if it's very specific, and if they take a period of a month or so to be completely abstinent at first. And the benefit of that is it resets your tolerance. It gives you a full sense of control, right? And then you could go in more empowered if you then decide that you want to try to moderate your use. Now, many people, when they take that initial month of not drinking at all, decide, you know what, this is easier. I don't want to go back. All right, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is a more intensive treatment, right? That is appropriate for people with more severe problems. And also parts of it are appropriate for people with more mild to moderate problems, or people who might not be very motivated. And this is a treatment developed by the National Institute of Health and the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. It's called Combined Behavioral Interventions, right? And the first part of it involves motivational interviewing, right? And this was designed for alcohol, but all of the principles are exactly the same when you're dealing with other drugs, right? So the behavioral treatments for alcohol and other drugs are almost exactly the same. So that's what's nice. You don't really need to learn different behavioral treatments for alcohol versus cannabis versus cocaine. It's all the same principles. So in the first part, we do motivational interviewing, right? And then in the second session, we provide feedback on their assessment data and use that feedback to sort of motivate change, right? And you could download this entire treatment manual through this web link. And again, I will share these to folks who are interested. So these are some open-ended questions that I like to use and that are in this manual. So I assume from the fact that you're here that you've been having some concerns or difficulties related to your drinking. Tell me about those, right? Tell me a little bit about your drinking. What do you like about drinking? What are the positives? What are the worries you have? What have you noticed about your drinking? How has it changed over time, right? What have other people told you about your drinking, right? What are other people worried about? It's most important to know what your client is worried about. It's also helpful to know what other people are worried about, right? It's helpful to be as specific as possible. If they say, you know, I know that my health is being impacted by this. I say, tell me more. What are you most worried about? Tell me about how your health has changed. The more specific people are, the more potent that is as a motivator. How would things be better if you changed? What's your next step? This is very key, right? We want to go from the broad, the why, to the how, right? Whenever we think about behavior change, SMART goals, first we have why. Why is about motivation, and then how is about how are you going to sort of follow through with that. Same thing goes with addiction treatment. With motivation interviewing, we want to be really aware of our tone, just like when I'm talking with my teenager, right, or my middle schooler, have to be very aware of my tone, right? If I have an angry tone, he's going to shut down, right? Same thing with clients. If there's any hint of judgment, they're going to shut down. So be very aware of our tone. We don't want to ask a lot of questions in a row, because what does that sound like? An interrogation, right? We want to ask a question, really take in what they say, and then reflect back what they say. So for you, your drinking used to feel like something that was a good part of your life. It allowed you to kick back, have fun with your friends. Recently, that's changed a little bit. Do I have that right? Right. So that's sort of the kind of style that you want to use. You want to avoid direct confrontation, right? And this sense of empathy. I love this quote, and it's not mine, but you see it out there a lot in the therapy world. People do the best they can with what they have. Like if we just take that with us every day, throughout the day, we would have a lot less road rage. We would get less mad in Kroger, right? We'd be better parents and friends and counselors, right? People do the best they can with what they have. There's no reason to be judgmental. This is another key thing about motivational interviewing. I love this. People are most persuaded by what they hear themselves say, right? If I tell you, you know what, your drinking is really, I could tell your drinking is impacting your ability to graduate college, right? Versus, tell me how drinking plays a role in your ability to get your college work done. And then they say it, right? We're most convinced by what we hear ourselves say. So as a therapist, you want to ask those particular open-ended questions that get your client to make the case for change. You don't want to tell them. They're going to shut down if you tell them, right? You want to figure out, really listen, and then it's sort of like volleyball. You want to set them up, right? You want to set them up, right? And let them say the thing that is then going to be what we call in motivational interviewing change talk, right? Change talk is like, you know what? I know my grades would be better if I didn't drink so much, right? You know what? I know all the money I'm spending on cannabis is the reason why I don't have enough money to, get my car fixed, right? Whatever it might be. You shouldn't tell them that. You should ask the question that gets them to say that. When they bring up concerns, get real specific. Tell me more about that. Tell me about a recent time where you regretted something that you did when you were high. What happened? What was the impact on other people? How did you feel the next day? All that is going to make people more motivated. How does your drug use fit with your overall life goals? Right? That's a really good question, right? Many people, especially young people, they view alcohol and drug use as time limited. Of course, it often is. They're often right about that, right? But of course, sometimes really bad things happen even during that period, right? But there's this perception of sort of invulnerability, right? So if somebody's not motivated to make a change now, I'll say, it sounds like you're not at a point where you're thinking about doing anything different right now. I wonder how you see this going in the future, right? What do you think this is going to be like when you're in your 30s, right? Oh, well, I'm not going to be smoking then. Why not? Tell me more about that, right? Well, then what do they say? Well, I mean, people that are smoking in their 30s, like that's different. Tell me more, right? They're making the case for why drug use, right, could lead to problems, right? So you're getting them to do the work. Sometimes we have to offer concern, right? Somebody might not have insight. I've had people swear up and down, I drive better when I'm high, right? We reflect that, we understand that, and we say, all right, I wonder what you know or what you've heard about what cannabis does to your motor coordination. What have you heard? And then you fill in the blanks, and then you say, what do you make of that, right? We call that in MI, elicit, provide, elicit, right? You ask what you know, because you don't ever want to tell somebody something they already know, right? And then you just fill in the gaps, and then you check in with them to see how they understood that, right? So that's sort of how we do that. This is what the feedback looks like. I'm going to talk, we're doing a study right now that I want to let you all know about at the end, where we are doing these brief interventions, and we give folks feedback like this. We have another session that I'll talk about that is all about helping to sort of build a life you want to build, helping to find drug-free ways of experiencing joy and meaning and purpose. They get paid a lot of money to do this as well. And it's for 18 to 29-year-olds who who drink alcohol, right? And who are not four-year college students or graduates. So that's sort of a neglected population in our society. Half of our country does not complete a four-year degree. And those folks tend to have more health difficulties, lower SES. And so this is a study that we're doing to try to help folks like that with doing some of these motivational interviewing sessions. And this is what that feedback looks like. We let them know how much their drinking compares to other people's drinking, right? And oftentimes when people see this feedback, they're very motivated to drink less. I had no idea that I drank more than 50% of other college students, right? Or whatever it might be. If you want to do this on your own, there's this really nice CDC guide to brief alcohol interventions in primary care that you can access here. Super guide. There's also a website that does this for free, that creates this really nice feedback about drinking risk, right? Risk factors, this is all personalized. Generic information is much less motivating than personalized information, right? So just like when you go to the doctor, if your doctor tells you about cholesterol generally, it's in one ear, out the other. But when you see your number, right, that's when you perk up, right? That's what's meaningful. When people see their drinking feedback, even though they're the ones that told it to us, they put it on a survey, but it's not until you have a conversation about it and give them written feedback that it really has an impact. Another thing in phase 2 of this treatment is doing, as I talked about, a functional analysis, when people drink, right? How it impacts other areas of their life, encouraging people to attend 12-step or other mutual health groups if that's right for them, right? And getting a significant other involved, especially people who are important, people you spend time with, and people who support your sobriety. This is for people with more severe problems that are actually seeking treatment. And the next phase for people that are in treatment and motivated, and things I would recommend folks who are supporting clients in recovery, is teaching life skills. We've heard this a lot today, right? Well, what are life skills? How to be assertive, how to have a difficult conversation, right? How to advocate for yourself, how to talk to your medical provider, how to talk to your landlord, how to resolve a conflict with your spouse, right? Or your child or your friend. Communication skills, coping with craving and urges, right? How to say no to a drink, right? How to tell people, you know what, I've made a change since the last time we hung out. I'm actually decided not to drink right now, just so you know, right? That's so important, right? We talk about in addiction treatment, seemingly irrelevant decisions, right? They don't seem important, but they're actually really important. That decision to not keep the bottle of wine in your house, that decision to tell your friends that you're no longer drinking, that's a critical decision that could be the difference between relapse versus recovery. Finding a job, right? Learning to manage your mood, social support, right? These are all the things that are in that phase, phase 3 of treatment, right? And this could go on for weeks, right? And it's very unique to the individual. Some people have no difficulty with assertiveness, but they really need help figuring out how to spend their time so that they could find other ways of experiencing joy and reward. Okay. I don't want to run over. I think I only have a minute left, right? So let me just briefly tell you about, this is a chapter that we wrote about what we call life enhancement treatments for addiction, right? Again, how to build a life worth living. I'm happy to send this out to people that might be interested. And, you know, in 1 or 2 sessions, you could really, this is what we do, is called a substance-free activity session. This is part of a research study that I mentioned, where you take the time to figure out what people find important in life, what their goals are, how they spend their time, right? We give people feedback on, let me show you this, how they spend their time. This is time allocation feedback. Well, okay, that one might be, there it is. Yeah, if you give them feedback, this is a graph. You can see somebody spends all this time drinking and recovering, and this is compared to family time, exercise, volunteer working. And we say, how does this fit with your goals and your values, right? And so seeing this sort of feedback is a way to put things in perspective and enhance motivation. And even people that don't have a desire to drink less or use drugs less can benefit from this session that is all focused about achieving your goals and experiencing joy and purpose. So I'm going to end on that. And again, thank you for all that you do. Let me put up our study. Here we go. This is our Project Blue, building the life you envision. And again, if you know any 18 to 29-year-olds, we started this study in Memphis, but most people prefer Zoom sessions. And so we're doing these sessions by Zoom. So now we're doing these all over the country with young people who have risky drinking. And they don't need to be motivated to change. They might be motivated to change, that's great. They might just want to earn $250 and get 2 free counseling sessions. And they could do that, right? So please spread the word, help us bring people in. And again, thanks for coming. If you want a copy of these slides, that's my email on the bottom. I'm also on Twitter. And again, thank you for all that you do. I appreciate it.